We are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, opposed to secret oaths, opposed to secret proceedings, secret proceedings. No official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.
What is going on, everyone? I still got some energy in me, so I figured I'd shoot out another podcast, which it don't matter anyways if you're listening on YouTube, because I am in YouTube jail. But yeah, I already did an update, so I have nothing else to update for you all. Just that I have a bunch of different podcasts planned, as usual. The mind never stops. This episode, we are going to be covering Charlie Manson. This will definitely be a subject that we will come back to. I just don't want to cram it all into one episode. Now, let's go ahead and just kind of chat about the several conspiracy theories that are already out there, because this is Conspiracy Corner Podcast. Here recently, earlier this year, if you're a podcast consumer like myself, I'm sure you've listened to Joe Rogan. I mean, he is the king of podcast. He had on a guest, and it was a mind-blowing interview, a mind-blowing podcast episode. He had on a guest. I cannot recall the man's name off the top of my head, but it was a gentleman who had spent, I think, 9 years writing this book on Charles Manson and basically connecting the dots in how he was connected with LSD experiments, like MK Ultra-ish type of stuff, without saying MK Ultra. I think he was alluding to it. And how basically Charlie was being used by the CIA. Today's episode, we're focusing on kind of the origin of Charles Manson, his childhood, and his rap sheet, and basically the origin of evil, and how he kept getting out and back on the streets. And this guy, in this interview, he pretty much lays it all out on how he was like used by the CIA. So I'm not surprised, and I'm sure most of my listeners aren't surprised. If you're tuning into Conspiracy Corner Podcast, I'm sure you all know how corrupt the FBI and the CIA and the American government in general are, you know. Now, there is another conspiracy about Manson, that the murders never even happened. Now, you can kind of get into that with, as far as like, that's a whole nother rabbit hole. And I'm not saying this is what I believe, I'm just laying it out there just because in general, this is what I cover on this channel is conspiracies. So don't blow me up in the comments thinking I believe this, but a lot of people, they have a belief that they never even actually happened, the murders, which they do have some weird stuff. Like there was accounts of Charlie while he was supposed to be locked up being sighted driving around in a red Ferrari with a girl. There is some weird stuff with the Sharon Tate photos of the death Like, for one, she still has all her color, even though the photos were supposed to be taken the next day after she was brutally murdered. She should have been pale. Um, she is smiling in one of the death photos, and that's not even a conspiracy. You can literally look that up. It's bizarre. Um, the actual murder itself, a lot of people think it kind of like her husband Roman Polanski, which in my opinion is a piece of garbage. For I don't know why. Well, I know why, but it still baffles me that Hollywood praises him as some messiah of filmmaking, and it's like he literally left the country because he was charged with rape of like a 14-year-old, I believe. Um, yeah. So I'm not going to say too much on that because anytime I start speaking out against pedophilia or rape, for some reason I get strikes. So, but yeah, you can delve down that rabbit hole all you want. I'm basically focusing on this episode, the actual facts of the origin of Charles Manson. So, let's dive in. Charles Manson was born no name Maddox on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, the illegitimate son of a 16-year-old girl named Kathleen Maddox. As with almost everything else written about Manson, his early years, even his date of birth is usually given erroneously, although for an understandable reason. Unable to remember her child's birthday, the mother changed it to November 11th, which was Armistice Day and an easier date to remember. Though Manson himself would later state that his mother was a teenage prostitute, other relatives say she was simply quote unquote loose. One remarked, "She ran around a lot, drank a lot, got in trouble. Whatever the case, she lived with a succession of men. One, a much elder man named William Manson, whom she married, was around just long enough to provide a surname for the youth. The identity of Charles Manson's father was something of a mystery. In 1936, Kathleen filed a bastardy suit in Boyd County, Kentucky, against one Colonel Scott. His first name remains unknown. Even in official records, he is referred to as Colonel Scott. So there's a little bit of government connection, perhaps, maybe. Maybe she was kind of like a CIA, what do they call it? Sex kitten, maybe? A resident of Ashland, Kentucky, on, on April 19th, 1937, the court awarded her a judgment of $25 plus $5 a month for the support of Charles Miles Manson. That's ridiculous, by the way. Like $5 a month for child support. Like, dude, they pretty much rape men with child support like nowadays. Though it was an agreed judgment, Colonel Scott apparently didn't honor it. For as late as 1940, Kathleen was attempting to file an attachment on his wages. Most accounts state that Colonel Scott died in 1954, though this has never been officially verified. Manson himself apparently believed it. He also stated on numerous occasions that he never met his father. According to her own relatives, Kathleen would leave the child with obliging neighbors for an hour, then disappear for days or weeks. Usually his grandmother or maternal aunt would have to claim him. Most of his early years were spent with one or the other, in West Virginia, Kentucky, or Ohio. I would like to, honestly, because I live in Kentucky, I won't tell you the exact location, obviously. But I would like to find his old stomping grounds, maybe like a house that he grew up in, or I don't even know how I'd be able to find that, because where it falls under the murderabilia category, and a lot of people look down upon that. I personally, I'm just interested in macabre and horror, and I'm not gonna lie. I mean, you guys see the stuff I cover. It'd be kind of neat to, because you guys know, if you keep up with my YouTube channel. If you haven't, if you're listening on a different platform, check out the YouTube channel. It's simply Abe Williams. The profile picture is a sideways dream catcher. But we do other stuff besides podcasts. We do ghost hunting, hiking, historical sites. I make videos too, so you're missing out if you're not checking us out over there, and you're kind of missing out a little bit because YouTube's been banning my stuff, so you have to check us out on different platforms. But I think it would be neat to find maybe a house that he grew up in, or something along those lines, and film a video. I think that would be dope. But I digress. In 1939, Kathleen and her brother Luther robbed a Charleston, West Virginia service station, knocking out the attendant with Coke bottles. They were sentenced to 5 years in the state penitentiary for armed robbery. While his mother was in prison, Manson lived with his aunt and uncle, McMecken, West Virginia. Manson would later tell his counselor at the National Training School for Boys that his uncle and aunt had some marital difficulty until they became interested in religion and became very extreme. Yeah, somebody who grew up in an extreme religious household, yeah, that can make you a little crazy. Did I turn into Charles Manson? No, but I am a little bit cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. A very strict aunt who thought all pleasure sinful, but who gave him love. A promiscuous mother who let him do anything he wanted, just so long as he didn't bother her. The youth was caught in a tug-of-war between the two. Paroled in 1942, Kathleen reclaimed Charles. Then, 8. The next several years were a blur of run-down hotel rooms and newly introduced quote-unquote uncles, most of whom, like his mother, drank heavily. See, Charlie actually was super against alcohol, so knowing his upbringing, it kind of makes sense. I digress. In 1947, she tried to have him put in a foster home, but none being available, the court sent him to Gibault School for Boys, a caretaking institution in Terre Haute, Indiana. He was 12 years old. According to school records, he made a poor institutional adjustment, and his attitude towards schooling was at best only fair. Though during the short lapses when Charles was pleasant and feeling happy, he presented a likable boy. He had a tendency towards moodiness and a persecution complex. He remained at Gibault 10 months, then ran away, returning to his mother. She didn't want him, and he ran away again. Burglarizing a grocery store, he stole enough money to rent a room. So there you go, there's his first crime. He then broke into several other stores, stealing, among other things, a bicycle. Caught during a burglary, he was placed in a juvenile center in Indianapolis. He escaped the next day. There you go, a little escape artist. When he was apprehended, the court, erroneously informed that he was Catholic, made arrangements through a local priest to have him accepted at Father Flanagan's Boys Town. He didn't make its distinguished alumni list. 4 days after his arrival, he and another boy, Blackie Nielsen, stole a car and fled at the home of Blackie's uncle in Peoria, Illinois. En route, they committed 2 armed robberies, one a grocery store, the other a gambling casino. So there you go. He committed more armed robbery and his first GTA, Grand Theft Auto. I wonder if he earned 6 stars. Among criminals, as in the law itself, a distinction is made between nonviolent and violent crimes. Manson had graduated, quote unquote, committing his first armed robbery at the age of 13. The uncle was glad to see them. Both boys were small enough to slip through skylights. A week after their arrival in Pariah, the pair broke into a grocery store and stole $1,500. For their efforts, the uncle gave them $150. 2 weeks later, they tried a repeat, but this time they were caught. Both talked, implicating the uncle. Still only 13, Charles Manson was sent to Indiana School for Boys at Plainfield. He remained there 3 years, running away a total of 18 times. According to his teachers, he professed no trust in anyone and did good work only for those whom he figured he could obtain something. So there you have it. That manipulative mindset, personality, to manipulate people. It's shining out, In February 1951, Charles Manson and 2 other 6-year-olds escaped and headed for California. For transportation, they stole cars. For support, they burglarized gas stations. Manson would later estimate that they hit 15 or 20 before, just outside Beaver, Utah. A roadblock set up for a robbery suspect netted them instead. In taking a stolen vehicle across the state line, the youths had broken a federal law, the Dyer Act. This was the beginning of a pattern for Charles Manson of committing federal crimes, which carry far stiffer sentences than local or state offenses. On March 9, 1951, Manson was ordered confined to the National Training School for Boys in Washington, D.C., until reaching his majority. Detailed records were kept on Charles Manson during the time he was there. On arrival, he was giving a battery of aptitude and intelligence test. Manson's IQ was 109. Though he had completed 4 years of school, he remained illiterate. Intelligence, mechanical aptitude, manual dexterity, all average. Subject liked best music. Observed his first caseworker with considerable understatement. Quote, Charles is a 16-year-old boy who has had an unfavorable family life, if it can be called family life at all. He was, the caseworker concluded, aggressively antisocial. 1 month after his arrival, quote, this boy tries to give the impression that he is trying hard to adjust, although he actually is not putting forth any effort in this respect. I feel, in time, he will try to be a wheel in the cottage. After 3 months, quote, Manson has become somewhat of an institution politician. He does just enough work to get by on. Restless and moody, most of the time, the boy would rather spend his class time entertaining his friends. Well, you have that definitely connection, correct? That he reminds you of a politician, because both are psychopaths, so I'll give you that. It appears that this boy is a very emotionally upset youth who is definitely in need of some psychiatric orientation. Manson was anxious to be transferred to Natural Bridge Honor Camp, a minimum security institution. Because of his runaway record, school officials felt the opposite. An example, transfer to a reformatory type institution was in order, but they decided to withhold decision until after the boy had been examined by a psychiatrist. On June 29, 1951, Charles Manson was examined by Dr. Block. The psychiatrist noted, quote, "the marked degree of rejection, instability, and psychic trauma in Manson's background. His sense of inferiority in relation to his mother was so pronounced," Block said, "that he constantly felt it necessary to, quote, suppress any thoughts about her," unquote. Because of his diminutive stature, his illegitimacy, and the lack of parental love, he, quote, is constantly striving for status with other boys, unquote. To attain this, Manson had developed certain facile techniques for dealing with people. These, for the most part, consist of a good sense of humor and an ability to ingratiate himself. This could add up to a fairly slick and constitutionalized youth. But one is left with feeling that behind all the lies, an extremely sensitive boy who has not yet given up in the terms of securing some kind of love and affection from the world. Though the doctor observed that Manson was quite unable to accept any kind of authoritative direction, he found that, quote, accepted with alacrity the offer of psychiatric interviews. If he found this suspicious, the doctor did not indicate it in his report. For the next 3 months, he gave Manson individual psychotherapy. It may be presumed that Charles Manson also worked on the doctor. There you go, that manipulative, I can't pronounce that word today, personality, working on the doctor. For in his October 1 report, Dr. Block was convinced that what Manson most required were experiences which would build up his self-confidence. In short, he needed to be trusted. The doctor recommended the transfer. It would appear that Charles Manson had conned his first psychiatrist, though the school authorities considered him at best a calculated risk. They accepted the doctor's recommendation, and on October 24, 1951, he was transferred to Natural Bridge Camp. That November, he turned 17. Shortly after his birthday, he was visited by his aunt, who told the authorities that she would supply a home and employment for him if he was released. He was due for a parole hearing in February 1952, and with her offer, his chances looked good. Instead, less than a month before the hearing, he took a razor blade and held it against a boy's throat while he sodomized him. So, that's pretty fucking hardcore. I don't blame them for not paroling him. As a result of the offense, he lost 97 days good time, and on January 18, 1952, he was transferred to the Federal Reformatory of Petersburg, Virginia. He was considered quote-unquote dangerous, one official observing, quote, he shouldn't be trusted across the street, unquote. By August, he had committed 8 serious disciplinary offenses, 3 involving homosexual acts. His progress report, if it could be called that, stated, Manson definitely was homosexual and assaultive tendencies. He was classified safe only under supervision. For the protection of himself as well as others, the authorities decided to transfer him to a more secure institution, the Federal Reformatory at Chillicothe, Ohio. He was sent there on September 22nd, 1952. So you see this Manson, man, he did not have a stable environment. Just transfer after transfer after transfer, after him acting up. Let's see. From the Chillicothe files, associates with troublemakers seemed to be unpredictable type of inmate who will require supervision both at work and in quarters. In spite of his age, he is criminally sophisticated, regarded as grossly unsuited for retention in an open reformatory type such as Killicoe. This from a report written less than a month after his transfer there. Then suddenly Manson changed. For the rest of the year, there was no serious disciplinary offenses, except for minor infractions of the rules, and a consistently poor attitude toward authority. His good conduct continued into 1953. A progress report that October noted, Manson has shown a marked improvement in his general attitude and cooperation with officers, and is also showing an active interest in the educational program. He is especially proud of the fact that he raised his educational level from lower 4th to upper 7th grade, and that he can now read most material and use simple arithmetic. Because of his educational advancement and his good work habits in the transportation unit, where he remained and maintained vehicles belonging to the institution. On January 1st, 1954, he was given a Meritorious Service Award. Far more important to Charles Manson, on May 8th, he was granted parole. He was 19 years old. One of the conditions of his parole was that he was to live with his aunt and uncle in Macon. He did for a time, then, with his mother, moved to nearby Wheeling. He joined her. They seemed drawn together, yet unable to stand each other for any length of time. Since 14, Charles Manson's only sexual contacts had been homosexual. Shortly after his release, he met a 17-year-old McMecken girl, Rosalie Jean Willis, a waitress in the local hospital. They were married in January 1955. For support, Manson worked as a busboy, service station helper, parking lot attendant. He also boosted cars. He would later admit to stealing 6. He appeared to have learned nothing. He took at least 2 across state lines, one stolen in Wheeling, West Virginia. He abandoned it in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The second, a 1951 Mercury, he drove from Bridgeport, Ohio to Los Angeles in July 1955. Accompanied by his now pregnant wife, Manson had finally made it to the Golden State. He was arrested less than 3 months later. It admitted both Dyer Act violations. Taken to federal court, he pleaded guilty to the theft of the Mercury and asked for psychiatric help, stating, "I was released from Killicoe in 1954, and having been confined for 9 years, I was badly in need of psychiatric treatment. I was mentally confused and stole a car as a means of mental release from the confused state of mind that I was in." The judge requested a psychiatric report. Manson was examined on October 26, 1955, by Dr. Edwin McNeil. He gave the psychiatrist a much abbreviated version of his past, stating that he was first sent to an institution for being mean to my mother. Of his wife, Manson said, "She is the best wife a guy could want. I didn't realize how good she was until I got in there. I beat her at times. She writes to me all the time. She's going to have a baby." He also told McNeil that he spent so much time in institutions that he never really learned much of what real life on the outside was all about. He said that now he has a wife and is about to become a father, it has become important to him to try to be on the outside and be with his wife. He said she is the only one he has ever cared about in his whole life. Dr. McNeil observed, "It is evident that he is an unstable person. He has an unstable personality and that his environmental influence throughout most of his life have not been good. In my opinion, this boy is a poor risk for probation. On the other hand, he has spent 9 years in institutions, with apparently little benefit except to take him out of circulation, with the incentive of a wife and probable fatherhood. It is with the incentive of it is possible that he might be able to straighten himself out. I would therefore respectively recommend that the court that probation be considered in this case under careful supervision. Accepting this suggestion on November 7, 1955, the court gave Manson 5 years probation. There remained the Florida charge. Though his chances of getting probation on it were excellent, before the hearing he skipped. A warrant was issued for his arrest. He was picked up in Indianapolis on March 14, 1956, and he returned to Los Angeles. His probation was revoked, and he was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment at Terminal Island, San Pedro, California. By the time Charles Manson Jr. was born, his father was back in jail. This inmate will no doubtly be in serious difficulty soon, wrote the orientation officer. He is young, small, baby-faced, and unable to control himself. Given another battery of tests, Manson received average marks in all the categories except word meaning, where he had a high score. His IQ was now on 121. With some perception, when it came to his work assignment, Manson requested a small detail where he is not with too many men. He states he has a tendency to cut up and misbehave if he is around a gang. Rosalie moved in with his mother, now living in Los Angeles, and during his first year at Terminal Island, she visited him every week, his mother somewhat less frequently. Manson's work habits and attitudes range from good to poor, noting his March 1957 progress report. However, as the time of his parole hearing approaches, his work performance report has jumped from good to excellent, showing that he is capable of a good adjustment if he wants to. His parole hearing was set up for April 22nd. In March, his wife's visits ceased. Manson's mother told him Rosalie was living with another man. In early April, he was transferred to the Coast Guard unit under minimal custody. On April 10th, he was found in the Coast Guard parking lot, dressed in civilian clothes, wiring the ignition of a car. Subsequently indicted for attempted escape, he pleaded guilty, and an extra 5 years probation was tacked on to the end of his current sentence. On April 22nd, the parole request was denied. Rosalie filed for divorce not long after this. The divorce becoming final in 1958, she retained custody of Charles Jr., remarried, and had no further contact with Manson or his mother. April 1958 Annual Review. His work performance was sporadic. His behavior continued to be erratic and moody, almost without exception. He would let down anyone who went to bat for him, the report noted. For example, he was selected to attend the current Dale Carnegie course, being passed over a number of other applicants because it was felt that this course might be beneficial in his case, and he urgently desired enrollment. After attending a few sessions and apparently making excellent progress, he quit in a mood of petulance and has since engaged in no educational activity. Manson was called, quote, an almost classic textbook case of the correctional institutional inmate. His is a very difficult case, and it is very impossible to predict his future adjustment with any degree of accuracy, unquote. He was released September 30th, 1958 on 5 years parole. By November, Manson had found a new occupation, pimping. His teacher was plus Frank Peters, a Malibu bartender and known procurer, with whom he was living. Unknown to Manson, he was under surveillance by the FBI, and he had been since released since his release from prison. The federal agents who were looking for a fugitive who had once lived with Peters told Manson's parole officer that his first string consisted of a 16-year-old girl named Judy, whom he had personally turned out. As additional support, he was getting money from Fat Flo, an unattractive Pasadena girl who had wealthy parents. His parole officer called him in for a talk. Manson denied he was pimping, and he was no longer living with Peters. Promised never to see Judy again, but stated that he wished to continue his relationship with Flo for money and sex. After all, he said, he had been in a long time. In the interview, the parole officer wrote, "This certainly is a very shaky probationer." Yeah, gee, you'd think. And it seems just a matter of time before he gets in further trouble. On May Day, 1959, Manson was arrested attempting to cash a forged U.S. Treasury check for $37.50 in Ralph's, a Los Angeles supermarket. According to the arresting officer, Manson told them he had stolen the check from a mailbox. 2 more federal offenses. LAPD turned Manson over to Secret Service agents for questioning. What then happened was somewhat embarrassing, unfortunately for them. Read a report of the incident. The check itself has disappeared. They feel certain subject took it off the table and swallowed it when they momentarily turned their backs. The charges remained, however. I love it. In mid-June, an attractive 19-year-old girl named Leona called on Manson's parole officer and told him she was pregnant by Charlie. The parole officer was skeptical and wanted to see a medical report. He also began checking her background. With the aid of an attorney, Manson obtained a deal. If he would plead guilty to forging the check, the mail theft charge would be dropped. The judge ordered a psychiatric examination, and Dr. McNeil examined Manson a second time. When Manson appeared in court on September 28, 1959, Dr. McNeil, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the Probation Department all recommend against probation. Leona also appeared and made a tearful plea in Manson's behalf. They were deeply in love, she told the judge, and would marry if Charlie were freed, though it was proved that Leona had lied about her being pregnant, and that she had an arrest record as a prostitute under the name Candy Stevens. The judge, evidently moved by Leona's plea and Manson's promise to make good, gave the defendant a 10-year sentence, then suspended it and placed him on probation. Manson returned to pimping and breaking federal laws. By December, he had been arrested by LAPD twice for grand theft auto and the use of stolen credit cards. Both charges were dismissed for lack of evidence. That month, he also took Leona, aka Candy, and a girl named Elizabeth from Needles, California, to Lordsburg, New Mexico, for purposes of prostitution, violating the Mann Act, still another federal beef. Held briefly, questioned, then released, he was given the impression that he had beat the rap. He must have suspected that the investigation was continuing, however. Possibly to prevent Leona from testifying against him, he did marry her. Though he didn't inform his probation officer of this, he remained free throughout January 1960, while the FBI prepared its case. Late in February, Manson's probation officer had visited by an irate parent, Ralph Samuels from Detroit. Samuel's daughter, Joanne, 19, had come to California in response to an ad for an airline stewardess school, only to learn after paying her tuition that the school was a fraud. She had $700 in savings, however, and together with another disillusioned student, Beth Belden, had rented an apartment in Hollywood. About November 1959, Joanne had the misfortune to meet Charles Manson, who introduced himself complete with printed card as President, 3 Stars Enterprise, nightclub, radio, and TV productions. Manson conned her into investing her savings into a non-existent company, drugged and raped her roommate, and got Joanne pregnant. It was an ectopic pregnancy, the fetus growing in one of the fallopian tubes, and she nearly died. Damn. The probation officer could offer little more than sympathetic ear. However, for Charles Manson had disappeared. A bench warrant was issued, and on April 28th, a federal grand jury indicted him on the Mann Act violation. He was arrested June 1st in Laredo, Texas, after police picked up one of his girls on a prostitution charge, and brought back to Los Angeles where, on June 23, 1960, the court ruled he had violated his probation and ordered him returned to prison to serve out his 10-year sentence. The judge observed, "If there ever was a man who demonstrated himself completely unfit for probation, here it is." This was the same judge who had granted him probation the previous September. The Mann Act charge was later dropped. For a full year, Manson remained in Los Angeles County Jail, while appealing revocation. The appeal was denied, and in July 1961, he was sent to the United States Penitentiary at McNeil Island, Washington. He was 26. According to staff evaluation, Manson had become something of an actor. He hides his loneliness, resentment, and hostility behind a facade of superficial ingratiation. An energetic, young-appearing person whose verbalization flows quite easily. He gestures profusely and can dramatize situations to hold the listener's attention. Then a statement which, in one form or another, was to reappear often in his prison records, and much later in post-prison interviews. He has commented that institutions have become his way of life, and that he receives security in institutions which is not available to him in the outside world. Manson gave as his claimed religion, here you go, people, Scientologist. Manson used to be a Scientologist. That's a whole nother rabbit hole in itself that I'm sure I will do an episode on one day. Stating that he, quote, has never settled upon a religious formula for his beliefs and is presently seeking an answer to his question in the new mental health cult known as Scientology. Scientology, an outgrowth of science fiction writer L. Ron Hubbard's Dianetics, was just coming into vogue at this time. Manson's teacher and example, quote-unquote, auditor was another convict, Lanier Rainier. Manson would later claim that while in prison, he achieved Scientology's highest level, quote-unquote, theta clear. Although Manson remained interested in Scientology much longer than he did any other subject except music, it appears that, like the Dale Carnegie course, he stuck with it only as long as his enthusiasm lasted, then dropped it, extracting and retaining a number of terms and phrases such as auditing, cease to exist, coming to now, and some concepts as far as karma, reincarnation, etc., which perhaps fittingly Scientology had borrowed in the first place. By the way, they ripped off ancient astronaut theory also, so Just saying, as an Asian astronaut theorist, they pretty much ripped it off and rewrote the Anunnaki story with Battlefield Earth. He was still interested in Scientology when his annual progress report was written that September. Furthermore, according to the report, that interest has led him to make a semi-professional evaluation of his personality, which strangely enough is quite consistent with the evaluations made by previous social studies. He appears to have developed a certain amount of insight into his problems. Though his study of this discipline, Manson is making progress for the first time in his life. The report also noticed that Manson is, quote, is active in softball, basketball, and croquet, unquote, and is a member of the drama club and the self-improvement group. He had become somewhat of a fanatic at practicing the guitar. He held one fairly responsible job 11 months, the longest he had held any prison assignment, before being caught with contraband in his cell and reassigned to janitorial work. The annual report that September took a close, hard look at the 28-year-old convict. Quote, Charles Manson has a tremendous drive to call attention to himself. Generally, he is unable to succeed in positive acts. Therefore, he often resorts to negative behavior to satisfy this drive. In his effort to quote-unquote find himself, Manson pursues different religious philosophies. An example, Scientology and Buddhism. However, he never remains long enough with any given teachings to reap meaningful benefits. Even these attempts and his cries for help represent a desire for attention with only superficial meaning. Manson has had more than his usual amount of staff attention, yet there is little indication of change in his demeanor. In view of his deep-seated personality problems, continuation of institutional treatment is recommended. On October 1, 1963, prison officials were informed, according to court papers received in this institution, that Manson was married to Leona Manson in 1959 in the state of California, and that the marriage was terminated by divorce on April 10, 1963 in Denver, Colorado, on grounds of mental cruelty and conviction of a felony. One child, Charles Luther Manson, is alleged to have been of this union. So now he has two children. This is the only reference in any of Manson's records to his second marriage and second child. Manson's annual review of September 1964 revealed a clear conduct record, but little else encouraging. His past pattern of employment instability continues, seems to have an intense need to call attention to himself, remains emotionally insecure, and tends to involve himself in various fanatical interests. Those fanatical interests weren't identified in the prison reports, but at least several are known. In addition to Scientology and his guitar, there was now a third. In January 1964, I Want to Hold Your Hand became the #1 song on the U.S. record charts. With the New York arrival of the Four Liverpool Lads, the following month the United States experienced later than Great Britain, but with no less intensity, the phenomenon known as Beatlemania. According to former inmates at McNeil, Manson's interest in the Beatles were almost an obsession. It didn't necessarily follow that he was a fan. There was more than a little jealousy in his reaction. He told numerous people that, given the chance, he could be much bigger than the Beatles. One person he told this to was Alvin Karpis, lone survivor of the Ma Barker gang. Yeah, I'd have to do an episode on them, Ma Barker gang. It's pretty wild stuff. I've heard their story like once. I can't remember a whole lot about it, but I just remember it was crazy. Manson had struck up a friendship with the aging gangster after learning he could play the steel guitar. Karpis taught Manson how. Again, an observable pattern. Manson managed to get something from almost everyone with whom he associated. May 1966, Manson continues to maintain a clear conduct record. Recently, he has been spending most of his free time writing songs, accumulating about 80 or 90 of them during the past year, which he ultimately hopes to sell following his release. He also plays the guitar and drums and is hopeful that he can secure employment as a guitar player or as a drummer or singer. He shall need a great deal of help in the transition from institution to the free world. In June 1966, Manson was returned to Terminal Island for release purposes. August 1966, Manson is about to complete his 10-year term. He has a pattern of criminal behavior and confinement that dates to his teen years. This pattern is one of instability, whether in free society or a structured institutional community. Little can be expected in the way of change in his attitude, behavior, or mode of conduct. This last report noted that Manson had no further interest in academic or vocational training, that he was no longer an advocate for Scientology, that, quote, he has come to worship his guitar and his music, and finally, he has no plans for release, as he says he has nowhere to go. The morning Charles Manson was to be freed, he begged the authorities to let him remain in prison. Prison had become his home, he told them. He didn't think he could adjust to the world outside. His request was denied. He was released 8:15 a.m. on March 21st, 1967, and given transport to Los Angeles. That same day, he requested and received permission to go to San Francisco. It was there in Haight-Ashbury section that spring that the family was born. Charles Manson was 32 years old. Other 17 of those years, more than half of his life, had been spent in institutions. In those 17 years, Manson had only been examined by a psychiatrist 3 times, and then very superficially.
We are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, opposed to secret oaths, opposed to secret proceedings, secret proceedings. No official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.